Good morning, everyone. My name's Ngozi, and I'll be spending the next hour and a half with you just talking and thinking about teams and team dynamics from a leadership perspective. Leading and managing teams is an area that has always generated lots of interest across a huge range of professional domains. What we need to think about is how team dynamics really shape how we are able to lead and manage people. And certainly today we will touch on some of those topics and be thinking together about your own context and what you'd like to think about today. So hopefully you'll be able to draw something out of the session. But team dynamics, as we covered it today, will be just a fraction of what we could be talking about together. So I'm hoping in the time we have together that you'll be able to take away something useful from the session. Before we kick off, it'd be really great to know who's with me today. So please do get in touch on the chat. Let me know your name, your role, so I can get an idea who's with me today, and at least we can form a bit of a relationship as we go through the rest of the session. As the course outline suggests, as managers and leaders, we're often concerned with how we build and enhance teams. There's a lot of challenge, a lot of pressures for us to make sure that performance is at its best. There's a huge amount of change across organisations and across team systems. So there's something about how we're able to really think about how do we bring out the best in the people that we're responsible for as a team leader or manager. Whilst preparing this session, I really reflected on my own experience of leading and managing teams over the past 20 years or so. And it really struck me that actually when we think about it, our experiences from teams, experience of managing teams can really be different from role to role. And similarly from organisation to organisation. It's easy to forget, or maybe not, that when we're talking about trying to work with teams and bring up the best, we're talking about people. And we're trying to think about how do we get to know our teams as best as possible, who are the people in our teams, and how do we use ourselves as managers and leaders to bring out the best in them. So there are a couple of things that we'll be touching on today. I think the challenge for us together is really going to be, it's such a broad topic, and you'll all have very different perspectives. So I think it's about making sure that we can really usefully come together to think about some of the things that might be helpful for you to think about what's going on for your context. So thinking about your individual experiences, I understand that some of you will be new to managing. Some of you will have led teams for a long time, for many years. I'm also aware that you could be joining me as a team member, but also if you're leading a team, you may well be part of a wider team system yourself. So I'm really keen to hold that in mind, that when you come into this session, you'll have your own thoughts and feelings and experience of team dynamics that'd be really good to hear about and really to enrich the session we have today. So as we move into the session, I'd really appreciate if you could help me understand really, when you thought about coming into session, what was it that resonated with you when it came to thinking about team dynamics? So when you're thinking about what you'd want to take away today, what kind of things happen for you in your own context that you really would like to unpack, understand, make more sense of? You might be dealing with or have dealt with challenges of change. You could be dealing with team conflict, perhaps a lack of motivation or poor performance. On the other hand, some of you may well have really positive and inspirational experience of being in a team that might be something that you want to be quite reflective about and think about for today. So I'd really invite you to maybe use the chat to just share some of that so that I get a sense of what is it that comes to your mind when you're thinking about team dynamics? What is it that really connects for you and you're hoping to understand? What I will try to do is through the session, I'll track any themes that come out. And if you are wanting to share, I will track some of those themes. We may not get the chance to follow all the threads, but perhaps in the Q&A session towards the end of the slot, I can pick up on any burning themes that have come up for people. And as I say, if you don't feel that anything comes to you now, there's always the opportunity throughout the session to really get to join in on the chat. So I'd really encourage you to do so, because I think that'd be great. So let's think about what we're going to cover today. So the main focus is sort of three big areas. And as I said in the opening, we won't necessarily cover everything that we could possibly cover when we're thinking about team and team dynamics. As I said, it's such a broad area. We've got huge amounts of thinking that's going on in research and around practice when it comes to leadership and management. But for today, we really want to think a little bit about what do we mean by team dynamics and why do they matter? Why is it that we want to think about that to understand our own practice? We'll touch on leading teams and what some of the challenges may be and how we might think about that. And then finally thinking about what might be some of the ideas and tools, I suppose, for thinking about how to get teams working. I think, as I said earlier on, these are some of the areas that I felt encapsulated what we could talk about today. I'd be really interested in thinking about what you were hoping to get out of the session and see whether we can make some connections. There may well be things that don't get captured in that agenda that we can certainly pick up as part of the question and answer session towards the end. So we can only really start to think about team dynamics if we start to think about what do we think a team is. There's a whole plethora of definitions out there, but I think this is one that I find helpful because it's really thinking about work-based teams. Have a quick look. I don't know what you think about that. But certainly in this definition, which isn't that old, really thinking of teams as being described as people embedded in organisations performing tasks, really driving towards the organisational goal. I'm interested in how that fits when you think about that. Does that make sense to your team? Does it make sense to the context in which you operate? But certainly, as I said, there are so many ways of describing what we think a team is. And actually, if we're really reflective about it, the concept of teams in organisations has really evolved significantly. Teams can vary in structure and size. They can be dispersed across localities and can exist virtually. Certainly in your social work context, managing teams where individuals are working out in localities and also where the boundaries may be much more porous to allow for multiple professional members. This can present some real challenges to how we bring out the best performance. And so it's certainly something we think we can hold in mind as we move through. Something that systems theory helps us think about is teams are complex social systems. When we think about how they function, systems theory would suggest that actually the context within which teams operate can only really be understood if we think about the wider context, the system, the organisational system. It invites us to really broaden our idea about teams and those within them, to really consider a team as being reflective of, but also influenced by wider organisational structures and cultures. If we look through that systems theory lens, it could be argued that actually complex social systems, if we stay with that paradigm, really invites us to think about the interconnections and relationships between members of that system. So within a team, there are loads of fluid and multiple ways of interacting. And that can cause some challenge, that can be potentially chaotic. But actually what it helps us to think about, if that's the case, then systems theory would say that what we tend to do as people, when we're faced with that multiplicity, that kind of chaotic potential, we will always find a way to find organising patterns. We will always find a way to what emerges from that sort of chaos, if we want to call it that, are really stabilising or organising patterns. And if we're reflective about that, some of those patterns can be helpful and containing. They are ways of people being together, repeating patterns that mean that they feel this is a safe place to be. This is how I make sense of this system that I'm part of. The other side, conversely, is that sometimes those patterns can be stuck. They might be unhelpful because this stabilising mechanism, this way of organising the system, has led to a degree of stuckness that means that actually it's not allowing the team to grow or develop or be enhanced. And one of the things that I think is interesting to invite you to think about is actually, is that something that's reflected in the teams that you sit in or reflected in the teams that you work with? Sometimes when we're thinking about we want to really improve the performance of a team, we haven't really thought about what are the patterns of behaviour, what are the things that are creating that safety or that stabilising element to the way everybody interacts within a team. So I recognise that, so from some of the comments coming through, that there are individuals who are dealing with new teams and trying to build those teams into whatever they need to be. But also, I think what seems to be apparent from what's been fed back in the chat is that actually a lot of you are dealing with really complex and challenging change and having to manage that. So if in this essence, when you think about that newness of either establishing a brand new team or trying to work through change with your team, it's useful to think about from a systems point of view, what might be the interruptions that are going to happen with this change? What are going to be the patterns of working and functioning as a team that you'd want to retain? Conversely, if there is resistance to change, why is that? What are the stabilising, organising patterns that have made people feel this is a really safe place to be? I don't really want change to happen. So in essence, sometimes we can think about those dynamics of patterns of behaviours in teams as being maybe a framework within which we can start to consider, how do we start to do change? How do we start to think about change with those team members who may be anxious about what the new future will look like? But we also have to recognise, and I think certainly reflecting on some of the comments coming through, that sometimes that change is being driven by wider context. So the organisation may be needing change to happen. And it may well be that actually the impact of the wider organisational change system destabilising some of those patterns and ways of being within the smaller team. And so sometimes it's how we lift it to think about what else is going on the outside. How might the team and the people that you're trying to take through the change make sense of the wider context, so they can try to make meaning of what's happening, and they can start to view themselves as a system, a team system, in relation to what might be happening across the wider organisation. So I think there's something about when we think about change and when we think about some of the dynamics that you're facing, it leads us to think about what the change will mean for the team. How might they view themselves differently? What do you feel as the manager and leader the team will look like once the change has had to happen? And if you think, going back to the sort of points on this slide, if it is a system that's found its way of working, has its patterns of stabilizing patterns, what will the new world look like? And how do you start to have those conversations with your teams to unpack the fact that they are part of a wider system? It may be useful to explore initially, and I don't know, for those of you who are facing this situation, whether you have had the chance to really consider where the team sits in the wider organisational system, but you may well do. But actually, where are you positioned as a change agent? There is some sense that sometimes when you're leading and managing a team, you are almost the conduit, the bit in the middle, where you have to translate messages about change from the wider organisation back into the team system. And similarly, you are also absorbing all those messages from the team about the change. So somewhere in that middle is the you, and how do you think of yourself as a change agent? One of the things that I think is quite helpful to reflect on is, where are you in relation to that change? If we're thinking of reflective leadership practice, it's certainly the sense that we start to think about, in order to become the change agent, there's something about how you understand your own response, your own position within that system first, to then be able to recognise, how do you do that brokering? How do you do that bounce between the wider team system and the rest of the organisation? So I think not just only thinking about yourself, and it's really good to see some of the reflections of the experiences for you coming through on the chat. And I will take some time to really kind of pull out what's emerging there. But it's interesting to think about how you then, and as I said, as I can see from the chat coming through, if change is one of the big dynamics for all of you, or for many of you, as it seems to be from the chat, what does that mean for team identity? Because actually, sometimes when we think about leading a team through change, and given that we've got the complexity of the team being made up of multiple and complex interactions, there is something about how you are holding in mind the vision for what the identity of the team will look like. So one important thing to remember is that whilst the team And thinking of your team, they'll have a name. They'll have a name and position within the organisational system. It's far from being a static entity. Teams comprise of, as we will know, real human beings with individual characteristics, personalities, and abilities and needs. So whilst it's possible for the team, by dint of job role and job descriptions and team descriptions, to really be articulated as part of a wider team system, there is something about understanding, how does the team see itself? What does it understand it to be? And I'm going to challenge myself and even sort of you to think about, I'm talking globally about team, but I think the bit not to lose is when we think about a team, as I said before, a team is a composition of a number of people. You are part of that team. You will bring your own context, your own story, your own way of being. And then it will be the interaction and the interface between you and all those other individuals who will bring their own stories and their own interactions. So somehow, when we think about who we are, it's about that conversation that helps us to make sense of who we believe we are. So one of the challenges always when we think about organisational change or organisational systems, there might be a wide narrative, there might be a broader description of who people think your team is, who they think that you are, and what your role dictates that you do. But actually, how do you understand that for yourself? And similarly, how do your team members make sense of that? So there's something about how when we think about change and when we think about where you fit and where your team fits in a wider system, really understanding, well, what creates that embedded sense of belonging to the team? What are the things, the tangible things, the feel, the characteristics that make your team members feel they belong to your team? You might have some ideas about that. You may never have thought about that. But certainly if we think of the wider system interface, everybody, including yourself, will be holding an idea of the who we are. And I suppose when we're trying to think about how we strengthen, I suppose, the team identity, it's about have those conversations happened, that every member of the team and you as the leader and manager of that team, do you have a shared sense of who you are? Is there a shared sense of what the team believe are the best ways of working, performing? What kind of goals or vision are there? And also really understanding that actually there will be, as part of the who you are, some really explicit things, as I said, the name of the team, where you're located, the outcomes that are reflected in the requirements for what the team deliver, but some really implicit things that maybe solidify who we are. And they might be the really subtle or covert behaviours, customs, practices that really shape that sense of team identity. And one of the things that we're always invited to do as leaders is to really reflect on that, because there is an argument to say that we are instrumental in a leadership role in shaping those behaviours, customs and practices. And actually, in order to do that effectively or to really take people forward to a new way of being, we need to understand our own behaviours, customs and practices. And we'll touch a bit on that a bit later on in the session. But certainly it's worth thinking about that actually when you're thinking about team dynamics, one aspect of it is, well, what are the mechanisms going on in this team and why? And what kind of team is it now? What kind of team do the members believe it should be? And what kind of team can it be in the future? And that is something that, particularly in the leadership capacity, you're invited to kind of reflect on and think about, how can you be this agent of change? How does it position you in your management and leadership role to be able to start to do that work with your team, or really at the very beginnings of it, start to understand the real context that's really shaping the behaviours, customs and practices that are going on in your team now. So certainly I think just interesting thinking about what people are sharing. I can see that people are experiencing things about being part of a bigger organisation, I'm just looking at what you shared, Pauline, which is really helpful, about how do you help people to understand that and look beyond themselves and their individual small teams. So we really think about how do we lift the vision to not seeing us being a micro team, but actually being part of that wider system. Certainly it is about how widely is that vision of a system shared? When do the conversations happen so that the small team recognise their role in the bigger piece? So, the image that I shared there where you had the cogs, how did the team see themselves not as an isolated cog, but actually what they do has an impact and a reciprocal impact on other parts of the system. So maybe part of beginning to help people move from seeing themselves as a small insular team is how to start opening up the vision and the view of the rest of the world. How do they get to understand that what they're doing in each of their individual team roles has a ripple effect, has a wider implication? And that might be starting to think with the team about where they think they sit, what influence they think they have, where do they sit within the wider organisation. And certainly, as I said, connecting with some of the things that are being shared around what change means and how challenging it can be. I just wanted to reflect with you about some of the challenges that you'll all be facing today. Turbulence, the particularly in local government, in terms of working in social work context, change is often and constant. How do you manage that? And so I was really thinking about if you wanted to really enhance the team and move them to a place where they could think about themselves now and in the future, it's something about how we start to dial up the capacity for the team to be more resilient. What is it that individuals within the team, and you have, as I mentioned before, very different personalities, different characteristics, everybody has a different relationship to change. So something about how that's understood in order to start to work in a way that builds up resilience of the team, because turbulence is a really constant feature. Change happens, it will happen constantly, it's going to happen in the future. So in a sense, when we think about teams in the future, there needs to be that sense of how do we create teams that are much more agile, people are much more prepared for change in the future, even if it's not even on the horizon. It's the capacity for individuals to feel prepared and ready for, I might be doing this now, but I also need to think about how I'm ready for if things look different in the future. And so that takes you back to thinking about how do you work with those individuals in a team to understand their readiness for change, even if it's not immediately on the horizon. And that might be through individual supervision. It might be having some opportunity to think together with the team about turbulence, really get a sense of how do people feel about it, acknowledging that it is a completely challenging set of work circumstances that everybody has to deal with. And sometimes preparing people for that turbulence is really about even giving them a chance just to be heard, just to recognise that it is known, it is something that's acknowledged. It may not be in your control to change, but it gives the opportunity for people to air the fact that they may be struggling, they may not really like the turbulence, they may have a real focus on why they're there, but not like the fact that it constantly changes. But sometimes starting to recognise how people react and respond to turbulence is that kind of reflective look inside to understand people's relationship to it. But certainly for leading some team through that, being able to think about turbulence and that constant change is a key part of what does the team of the future look like. Just touching on some of the other parts of the acronym, enthusiasm. Somehow, through all that challenge and turbulence, we have to keep the motivation of staff going. We need to keep them passionate and enthusiastic about the work. That's not always easy. And certainly within a social work context, the challenge is how do people stick with their passion and continue with that and bring that to the work every day. And so certainly thinking of the structures and I touched on before when I talked about the behaviours and the customs and practices, how do we create something that allows people to tap back into those passions what are the opportunities, I suppose, rather than mechanisms, what are the opportunities for people to really reconnect with what brought them into the work initially? Also, sometimes when we think about enthusiasm, it can really be about giving people the sense that they can move forward, they can develop. So making sure that we're thinking about how do team members connect with their enthusiasm and passion, even if it means that they're thinking, this is me on my journey somewhere else. Ambition. That goes back to where, we really need to think about, in today's climate, what's the vision for the future? Sometimes the vision isn't known yet. Sometimes it is. And just, touching on something that where change happens, it can be quite involuntary. It can be something that's been, I suppose, orchestrated in another part of the organisational system. So the vision for the future may not be generated by the team itself, but somehow being able to get to a place where there is a sense of ambition. So being the best team that can possibly be, that's about really making sure that in today's climate, how do we connect people back into, let's have a clear purpose here. Even if it's challenging, what do we know about our own resilience and our own agility that allows us to still be ambitious within difficult circumstances? And then it's about the momentum, keeping that pace and energy going. A huge challenge in today's climate. And somehow there's something about mechanisms or spaces that allow us to keep that energy going so that people feel that they're on their way to achieve success. You may have dips, and there may be, particularly with, if we touch on turbulence and change, but actually the momentum can really get stuck, or it can really slow down. And when we step back a little bit, and there may be elements of this that, when I talk about the acronym, there may be areas of this that you can connect with, that when you think about where you are now and where you think about where your team are now, you might be thinking, actually, we're really stuck in thinking about turbulence, or I need to do that. I need to make some space to think about how do we think about the changes that we're going to be facing. You may also be thinking about how do you get some momentum going. You might have a new team. And I think, you may be stepping into a new leadership role. So certainly from what we'll touch on a bit later is how do you think about energizing your team? What do you understand about the individuals in the team so that you can really galvanize action? You can really galvanize people to want to bring their best self every day. And what I would argue is that these sound like amazing things to be able to achieve, but I know they are challenging. And what we won't lose sight of today is actually these are real challenges to be able to do it and bring it every single day. These two definitions, which are standard definitions, I think are really useful to help you understand that if we apply this to team, it gives you a sense of what we mean by team dynamics. So forces that produce movement. So connecting with change. We may be coming into this session from a stance where we think about how do we bring about change? How do we manage the changing context in which we need to operate? So this bit about the forces, so what are they? What are the things that can produce movement within a team? That's when we're thinking about team dynamics in that particular context. But similarly, the second description, forces and processes that produce change inside a group or system. And that might be more about how are the team working together? What might need to be thought about? What's the interplay or the interaction between members of that group or members of the system? So certainly the dynamics are the effort and the energy and the processes that will bring about the change that's desired as we go through. Why do we need to think about it? Why is it important? Because I think if we're not paying attention, it has an impact and it can really create some problems within teams. So just reflecting on the balance, we want to get the balance right between team success, which is often a driver, going back to why we think teams exist within organisations. So at the moment, you be reflective of your team. There are people, there's hard work going on. There's, people who really connect with the values of the work. So there's a real belief in the cause. And so essentially you've got people coming in every day, and that can include yourself, coming into the role every day, putting 100% in and really believing in the cause, the reason for being there. But what stops effective performance, what stops performance being where we'd like it to be, could be some of these reasons that are set out on the slide. It could be about goals aren't that clear, or there's confusion. Also, you may well have a lack of agreement between goals. So you may have members within a team, even you as a leader, may have different ideas about what the goal of the team, what the outcome being sought should be, and how to get there. Similarly, leadership may feel quite poor. It might feel quite fragile. And that's going to really undermine the effort and the hard work and the belief. And that might be something that needs to be thought about. And then again, also, personality conflicts. You know, as I said before, when we talk about teams, they're not a static, solid thing. They are a combination of human beings and people coming together to try and achieve things. So what that means is that we're talking about very different people, very different personalities. And part of what we think about is how do we understand those different personalities so that we can bring out the best in individuals? And certainly that kind of also connects with what do we know about what people feel in their role? What are they aiming to do? What are their hopes as part of that team? Because it can connect with this idea that actually people are sitting in unresolved roles. There's not clarity there. Or they may feel that there isn't a fit. And so certainly there's something about how do we work with team members who may not be in the right role, and how might that shift on? And so if we're looking for how we move things forward, and this is quite an interesting one because it's not just about achieving the goal. I think the combination of those aspects of communication, performance, skills are identified as being fundamental to having that high-performing team, being able to achieve the goal. But actually, you may be thinking and reflecting on your team position and recognise that actually skills is not an issue, because I think you may have highly skilled individuals, practitioners who are well aware of what they need to do and have the skill set to do it. But actually, communication may not be great. There may be a blurring of understanding as to what the goals or expectations are. There may be communication that needs to be addressed between team members, and that's impacting on how those skills are being deployed. Similarly, performance being the best that they can be, or whether that's individual team level, individuals within a team, or a whole team level, could be because the skills are mismatched, or the skills haven't been focused on. And that's going to impact on achieving whatever the shared goal is. And so actually there's something about, in a reflective way, really sort of thinking, well, where are we with this? Where do I think my team is in relation to those three things? Is communication good? Do I think it's good? Have I really checked in? Am I part of a really strong communication network? Because I recognise many of you will be you'll be managing and leading teams, but you'll also be part of a wider team. And there's something about how communication at every level allows you to be better informed, to be able to support your team members. So what steps can you take to understand the wider system so that you can strengthen the communication, and so that you can then support your team to understand what the focus of the goal is and where it fits? These things combined really help us to think about, going back to where I mentioned about the forces that create movement in terms of dynamics. It's actually how these dynamics come to play to bring about change in any of these areas. What are the things that need to be thought about in making sure that we can reach the best performance that we can? But actually, if we don't pay attention to these sorts of team dynamics, it may lead to team conflict. It may lead to demotivation, which can actually be quite destructive. It may lead to ways in which that element of conflict and demotivation really challenges performance. It really stops people being able to perform in the best way they can. It means that you're really challenged when thinking of the whole team system. How can it be performing in the best way it needs to be? Because actually we've got issues of unresolved conflict or really demotivated staff. And certainly it's going to be something that really stands out in relation to change and how people feel about that. So not addressing conflicts between members may create long-term detrimental effects, and it might impact, as I said, quite negatively on what they feel able to do. And so really there's something about how we understand the relationships to be able to maximize those positive aspects of it. So really, if we think about team dynamics and really try to understand them, it's about really maximizing those forces that are positive, that really help dial up the way in which a team can operate. But leading teams can be hard. And I think one of the things to think about is understanding who is in your team. When we think about how we bring about better performance within a team, we need to be quite reflective about that and try and work out who makes up your team. What do they value? What are their ideals? What are their motivations? You yourself are part of the team, and you may have your own values and ideals and motivations. And certainly what I'd invite you to think about is whether there's a fit with those of the team and your own. Is there a fit between the team? Are there sort of beliefs and values that are really causing a jar? Or actually, do you feel that you can really understand where people are coming from, what their motivations are, what their beliefs are about the work? So exploring those, and there are many ways in which you can do that in terms of having an opportunity to really check out with the team what their values are. What is it about them as an individual, personally and professionally, do they find governs the way in which they work? Exploring that can really help the understanding of self. So whether it's thinking about you as a leader and manager, but also your team members, and how might you bring those together so that you can recognize, who have I got in front of me? That might be really apparent to you. You may have really strong relationships with individuals, and as you've got to know them, you really have a sense of what their value base is. If you're moving in with a new team, the challenge may be that you're at the very beginnings of the journey. So I suppose when we think about team dynamics, one of the opportunities you have at the very beginning of your journey with a team is to check that out and start to get to know. Do some real clear activities, which can be part of the whole joining, which might be around, how do we understand each other? What are our motivators? What can we learn from each other? And that's from our own personal stories. It could be from our professional stories. What were the journeys that brought us to this point as we begin together as a team? So that could be a really useful, powerful session to have with your team. So you start to think about the who have I got there? Similarly, you may well be with a team that you've been with a long time. It's still an opportunity to revisit those. When was the last time you really checked that out? When have you had the space to think about who we all are and what we bring? So it can be that can also be a re-getting to know. People change. Priorities have changed for people as you move through life. Your own priorities may have changed, the way that you view the world. So it's an opportunity to really think about, how do we understand each other? How do I understand my team values? How do they understand my own values? So they recognize these values are what sit behind my behavior, the way I respond to them, the way they respond to me, and the way they respond to each other. So it's how you make time to really create that space as a system to revisit how you know each other. And I suppose what I'm talking about is, how do you nurture that reflective practice? Many of you and your teams will be thinking about reflective practice as you interface with the families and children and young people and adults that you work with. How much of that are you able to make space for to do as a team? How do you nurture that reflective practice? So it's not just faced on the front line, but actually you're turning it inwards and really trying to nurture this reflective practice about how you are together as a team. How do you understand what you bring, and how can you then, in understanding that, start to dial up the things that work really well? And what I would say is that one of the things that's quite important about being quite reflective, or trying that reflective approach to understand ourselves in a team system and the team itself, is that it's okay sometimes we get things wrong, but actually learning from the getting it wrong in trying to bring about a stronger team can be as powerful as getting it right. And sometimes that transparency and the engagement with it, with team members, means that it's a way of engaging people and they get on board with it, but recognizing that it's not always going to be perfect. You're not always going to get it right. They're not always going to get it right. But nurturing that practice and that culture of being quite reflective means that it's seen as a learning. Getting it wrong is seen as learning opportunity. Not always responding in the right way, not always understanding what's gone on behind an interface or a dialogue, but being transparent about that and wanting to learn about that creates a very different culture and potential for change. So I think I just want to sort of share this with you because I think it's quite a lengthy thing, so we won't go into too much detail, but there's something about, I said, that reflective bit and really reflecting on who you have in your team. I think Belbin's sort of ideas are really interesting and they will connect with many other perhaps models that you've seen in other places, but this really talks about the different type of team personalities that you have. And I'm sharing it with you because I think it's always interesting as a reflective tool to think about who you have in your team, but also where do you see yourself? So I'll just run through quickly in terms of these different types of roles. And it may be that you can think of where you are with it. You might instantly start to think of some of the people in your team and how they connect with these ideas. But the coordinator personality is somebody who's quite person orientated, committed to team goals. The shaper, very task focused, motivated to achieve. You've got what's described as the plant. This is the person who's the idea maker, not really concerned with details, but amazing at generating ideas and thinking creatively. The resource investigator, someone who's always on the lookout for new opportunities, really good at connecting with other people, developing contacts outside of the team system, quite enthusiastic about that sort of securing and identifying resources. And then you've got the implementer, who as a characteristic is described as somebody who's quite disciplined, conscientious and practical. The evaluator, careful, serious-minded and can be judgmental, but they're also sort of countered by the team worker who's very diplomatic, agreeable, and really keeps team spirits up. And then you've got the completer finishers, attention to detail, quite thorough, not really keen on delegating because they want to make sure they get things right. And then the specialist who's quite single-minded, a self-starter but not very interested in the work of others. So I suppose it's thinking about when you understanding who's in your team, what do you recognise in that? Do you see yourself in any of those? I suppose these aren't necessarily finite types of characteristics, and the idea is that most of us will reflect different aspects of that at any one time. But what's argued is that actually for a well-performing team, it is going to be the balance of those different types of characters and personalities. And there's something about how you're able to use quite a self-evaluative approach to understand who is in your team, but also how you all as a team understand each other. So things like knowledge, skills and abilities inventories, and one that comes to mind that's quite interesting is the Stevens and Campion tool, which really tries to capture the sort of skills and capabilities, but also self-managing. So how, what do I know about myself? And then what do I know about my motivations? They're the kind of things that can allow you to start to really understand who you have in your team and therefore start to bring out the best in people, or think about how might you start to deploy those skills in a helpful way, but also how do people start to understand who they are and what they're bringing and how they contribute to the whole team identity. So I think in terms of your own role as a leader, it's really, as is argued, that you are creating the conditions to enable a team to do its job. And that's the hard bit, because I think it's about, you need to understand your own capacity to do that. And sometimes that's about recognizing your own strengths, going back to the kind of self-reflective tool. How are you experiencing some of the changes? How are you experiencing the context for change? what's the expectation on you, and what do you know about yourself and your response to change that means that you're able to look after yourself in order to then take the team through either changes or to work with the dynamics within the team. And so that kind of touches on, you need to know yourself in the leadership and management role in order to then be able to, as the last point says, really coach and support the team to success. You may well be dealing with challenges around performance, but one of the things to recognise is, where are you in relation to those challenges? How are you sitting in a management role? And what might you do to start to reflect on your own position and capacity and context, so that you can either start to make changes for yourself and in how you want to practice, or recognise that interaction, that relationship between the team dynamics and you. How are you being pulled? What are the pulls? Why does it resonate with you? What is it doing for you, in order that you can start to move away from patterns of leading and managing that may not allow you to be able to step back a bit and think, okay, how do I start to create these conditions to improve the dynamics in the team? Because when we think about, as I said before, being able to recognise our capacity means that we have to be able to think about, how do we boost that enthusiasm? How do we get people through a change? What do we draw on? And one of the things that's quite important to think about is our own relationship to change, our own capacity to be energized. There's a suggestion that sometimes when you're managing, leading teams, it's not an act, but you have to bring a degree of energy. You have to kind of find a way, even if it's very hard, to be able to bring a level of enthusiasm to then infuse other people. That takes a lot of self-reflection. And in doing that, you need to know where you are personally and where you are professionally. Being able to create the kind of conversations that mean that you are able to talk about and even think about an ambition with your team means that you need to think, well, where do I get my reflective space? How am I thinking about the ambition for the team? Where can I bounce my ideas off? How do I recognise where my vision for where the team are now, and where do I take them? Because part of what's expected and what part of the idea is that as the leader and the manager of the team, you do that creating of a shared ambition. You galvanise action. You tackle those forces that are undermining the efforts to have a really high performing team, but also that keeps the momentum going. And so there's something about how you have the space to think about your own leadership style and your own needs as a leader. Where are your priorities and values? And therefore, once you understand those, how do you then draw them out and use them to bring out the energy in other people? So I suppose just to summarise, it's really about thinking about using yourself as an agent for change. So this use of self bit really connects with, what change do you want to see for yourself? Where are you in your leadership journey? How does your current positioning in relation to the team, how does it fit with your own direction of travel? I'm not sure what opportunities you've had to sort of really reflect on your own journey, but that might be something that you have to grab and make space for. So it might be that you use some of the tools and mechanisms, whether it is for your own supervisions, to be able to think about, where are you now, and what does it mean for you to be an agent of change? What might be the blocks, but what might be the enablers? So having a bit of space initially to try and unpack, how do you see yourself as an agent of change? And therefore, how do you then deploy yourself to be able to bring out the best in other people? So this awareness of self becomes quite an important part of it. And knowing who we are means that we can start to think a bit more reflexively about what we might be bringing to a team dynamic. Because I suppose if we go back to sort of systems theory, the sense is that we're never outside of the system. So when you're leading people, you're never outside of it. There's always an interaction. So your personal view of the world, your sense of agency, whether you can create change, whether you have a belief you can create change, your positioning. So how are you located in your team? How are you viewed outside of your team? All of those things will be adding to your sense of your agency. And those feelings, beliefs, I suppose the less tangible things that make us feel we can do this role will be part of what we're bringing and adding to a team dynamic. And so certainly when we're thinking about leading teams, it's about how we think self-reflexively. So what's the impact of our wider context on us as a manager and leader? What are the drivers for us as managers and leaders? And therefore, what do they do for how we behave? What do they do for how we think about communicating? I mean, and really it's trying to dial that up so that we can start to think when we're looking at a team and we're thinking about team dynamics and wanting to bring about something different, we have to recognize that systemically we may well be part of that system as well. And we have to also recognize that we have to be quite reflective about what we bring, and therefore how do we consciously start to do things differently or have different conversations for change. So we're just going to take a little bit of time to think about how do we get teams working. It can feel really difficult and it can feel a bit overwhelming, I think, to try and think about some of the challenges that, were reflected on before. But we still have this drive to say we've got to really get a handle on the team dynamics. We have to understand who's in the team. We have to understand ourselves. And then we have to try and make things happen. Increasingly, the context in which you're working in means it's incredibly challenging to try and hold all those things in mind and still feel, right, I can be creative, I can be reflective, I can be reflexive. And having enough space to think about it is always the ongoing challenge, which I think I recognise. And so there's something about really, and I can't sort of emphasise it enough, really thinking about how might you make a space or carve out a space for you to be quite reflective about how you're sitting in your team management and leadership role, and therefore thinking about how can you be most impactful. And really the drive in the context we're talking about and in the topic we're talking about is in order to get teams working well, in order to really, as I said, dial up the positive dynamics, the positive forces that really generate ongoing momentum in a team, really get people galvanized and working well, and really trying to subvert and undermine those negative forces that might be creating some stuckness and addressing team conflict and other sorts of things that seem to be emerging and may well be part of what you're dealing with. So certainly there is some reflection, and as I said, we're talking about how you as a leader may think about yourself. And there are some ideas about some of these leadership styles. You may have had the opportunity to think about your own leadership style, but I just want to touch on a few that might be helpful to think about. And so one of the things I'll share in terms of thinking about these leadership styles is that actually they may be ones that you deploy constantly. There may be ones that are deployed given particular circumstances. But I'll tell you a bit about each of them, and then you may be, as you're thinking, you might be thinking about what you draw on, but also thinking about what you're trying to deal with. There may be things that you may feel you want to draw on a bit more. So, for example, a more directive style. And I suppose the sense of this style is really thinking about when do we need to be much more directive? The argument would be that normally when there's a sense of the team task not being that clear, or you've got team members who might maybe lack skill or confidence, which you may see that in your teams. You may have newly qualified, you may have new staff who may not feel as confident or have the skills that they need to acquire. So essentially that really pulls you to be much more directive. That's much more about setting goals, giving guidance. I suppose the risk is when you stay in that space without thinking about, has that person moved forward? Have they been able to then get a grasp of or grip of what they need to do? So it could be a way of being for a time limit. And I suppose from a reflective point of view, it's how often are you using this style? Is that your natural style? What impact do you think it's having in your team? And as I said, there's opportunity for it to be a really helpful style where you've got, as I said, when the task is not that clear, or you have members who may not feel as confident as they should be, or may not have the complete skill set. It's helpful, but it might not be so helpful when it's deployed with those who feel very skilled and very able and really don't need as much guidance and might need a different way of drawing out their sort of capability. Achievement orientated, again, is one which is really focused on the outcome, the goal. And so it's really about setting, but this time you're really thinking about those who have the skills and confidence and capability. And, their motivation is quite high. So what you're doing is, in this kind of style, it's very much orientated to the outcome, achievement, really setting some challenge when it comes to the goals. And really, you're, in your management role, you're really clear about the expectations. And that could be on the achievement of the goal and when it happens. It also could be your expectation on that person. So it could be about acknowledging the fact that that they're skilled and they're capable. And so they're coming away with a real sense that you've got a belief in them and an understanding of what they can potentially do. And this can sometimes have the opportunity to really stretch people, and those people who respond to really getting that positive feedback, but also having an actual concrete goal to achieve. So that's much more achievement orientated. And those are kind of more transactional type styles where your input and you expect to see an outcome. So they're much more sort of transactional. Supportive is really coming into play, and as a leadership style is really when the tasks are quite clear, they're quite predictable, there's not a lot of volatility, but it may well be that the team members are individuals who, again, may not have the skill set that you'd want them to have, or they might not have reached yet. They might not be fully motivated, and they might be not as capable as maybe other members of the team. With this, it's really about thinking about what support needs to be put in place. What's your understanding of this lack of motivation? It could be something that's coming in from outside the work context. It could be within the work context. So when you're deploying your supportive style, it's really about slowing down and creating that space to understand what might be going on for this person here, but deploying your supportive leadership approach in a way that you want to see change and movement. You want to see that actually I understand enough about how this person will get to the task done, because I need to know what their motivation is, and I need to give them enough support so they can move beyond it. Again, similarly, I think for me with the directives leadership style, you need to think about that, because actually what you don't want to be doing is supporting an individual who doesn't need supporting in that way. So it's really being aware that actually when you're deploying the support, it's for a period of time. And where do you want them to get to? What's your ambition for that member of staff? What's their ambition for where they are? So you may well be starting with a supportive style, but moving them on to a bit more ambition and getting them to move to a place where you've tackled the skill deficit, I suppose, and you've really thought with them about motivation. Finally, being much more facilitative as an approach really is where you're using yourself to really tackle tasks or help team members tackle quite complex tasks. This normally works in a way where the actual task might be a bit fuzzy, a bit more unclear. There might be some mutual consultation with team members about how it can be achieved. So you're bringing in much more of a sort of facilitative coaching style. You're using yourself, bringing your input and your expertise and knowledge in, but also you're working with team members who have the skill and motivation and their ability is high. So you're not stepping in to do it for them, but you're really trying to work collaboratively to reach the outcome that's required. And I suppose to think about these things is, I'm interested in where you see yourself utilizing these styles, and whether it connects with any situation you've got now, and where you see yourself maybe leaning more towards consistently in your approach. Does it work for many different members of your team? Have you thought about maybe how these styles may be helpful with certain members of your team? I'm just leaving you to kind of think about that and see whether that kind of sits with you. So I think, as you say, Samira, leadership style does depend on the worker and the situation. And I think when I kind of connect your point to our own sort of self-reflection, it's about, as you say, being able to deploy different styles and knowing that you're doing it consciously, being able to deploy the style to bring out the best in that individual. So I suppose in that point, it's the interface between your understanding of the individual and your understanding of yourself. How do you bring yourself and use yourself to then tackle what might be going on for another person, or to simply just bring out better performance in somebody? So knowing them enough to say, actually, this particular leader style in this situation is going to be helpful, and it will change. That's a really useful kind of reflection, Samira. But ultimately, it is trying to understand, and I suppose that kind of nuance. So certainly if you're not thinking about your own style in relation to some of the changes you want to bring about, the nuance, I suppose, in terms of what I'm inviting you to reflect on is, what is the change? What's that difference that's going to make the difference? What is the thing that and it could be a slight shift. It could be connecting with what we just talked about. It could be that you're stuck with a particular situation. You're stuck with trying to move something on or create a change that seems to be quite tricky. And so the difference that makes the difference is really trying to reflect on the situation and identify, well, if I tried this, would that create the shift? Would my way of being here, or me tapping into that individual's motivation, is that something that might be something different? And that could be the difference that makes the difference. And I suppose with that first point, I suppose what I'm trying to emphasize is that actually making change happen, it can be small things, it can be huge changes, and it can be quite drastic. So along that spectrum, it could be anything that fits along a way of understanding what are the steps that need to happen in order for change to happen. And sometimes just understanding those steps can be the first part in making the change happen. So there's almost like an early stage implementation where you're trying to understand, well, what is it that needs to happen? How do I understand what the change is that needs to happen? And it could be taking that refreshed look at the team, an individual, at yourself, at the system. So really starting to think about what needs to really happen here, and what is it? Why do I think it needs to happen? So where is that coming from? Is it about my own need and my own dynamics? Or is it genuinely a dynamic that sits within the team? Or is it something that's been pulled in from the wider system? One of the things that, to create any of that change, we really have to think about communication. We really need to think about, how do we articulate what the change is that needs to happen? Where are we with the other's understanding of the change? And I suppose it can be, I'm not sure for you, for you guys, where your context is in terms of communication, but I can't emphasize enough how important communication. So whether it is at the level of team, whether it is for you interfacing with your colleagues or your senior managers about the change that needs to happen, communication is fundamental to thinking about the change. And I think certainly without that, we go back to some of those forces that undermine team dynamics. It goes back to thinking that how do you create a shift without creating the environment and the culture and the context and the mechanisms for communication to happen? And that's not to say it's easy communication. It's genuinely going to be something that might tax you and organise you. It may be something that means that sometimes what needs to be talked about can create turbulence, can create some difficulties. Having those honest, open conversations can be tricky. It can be conversations that need to be had with an individual. And I suppose one of the things to think about is how you are able to do that with a clear idea as to what is the difference that needs to make the difference. What is it that needs to be said in a clear way that then starts to generate new thinking in the other? And that could be on an individual context, or it could be in a team context. But it's always thinking about what is the difference that you're wanting to see, and how can that be understood by the other? And it helps us to move out of holding these ideas in our head and thinking, I'm going to try this because I want this change to happen, but we haven't communicated it. We haven't made clear what our ambitions are, what our vision is for change. And I suppose when I refer to vision, I'm not just talking about the team vision. I'm talking about, it could be an individual. What's your idea about how you envisage change happening for that person? How are they involved with that? What's their understanding of that change? Have they had some reflection on it? Do they have some sense of what they feel needs to be done differently? So sometimes we kind of skip that step because it's tricky, it's hard, it's challenging. We sometimes have conversations, those difficult conversations that we don't really want to have because we personally feel anxious about it. We know our individual team members enough to know it can be really hard. But part of us standing in a reflective stance and self-reflective stance is knowing what it does to us, knowing how difficult it may be to have some of those tricky communications or communication generally, and then working to say, actually, let me focus on what difference that needs to be made, and therefore use that as the mechanism to galvanize me to have that communication. And I suppose thinking about getting teams working, that trickiness and that difficulty really makes me think about, you would have likely heard of this anyway, but the model around how teams achieve good performance. So Tuckman's model, which is, I'm sure you're familiar with, the forming, storming, norming, performing, which are seen to be these 4 stages that any team needs to go through to achieve good performance. And when we connect it with communication, there's this idea that actually, for those of you who may be starting a new team or maybe reflecting on the team you have now, that the forming stage is really where a team learns to deal with each other. And that's where your leadership is very much more directive. And I sort of flagged this up because actually the sequence of this is really, as I said, as a stage model, it's about thinking about the steps that teams go through. But I also think it's really helpful to think about quite established teams. You might have a team that's stuck at a particular stage. And that's not to say you're necessarily developing a new team, but some of the ideas or the idea behind it might be useful to think about, well, what is going on here? So forming, which is the really starting to learn how to deal with each other, because teams are not static. I think some of you may be at the beginning starting to lead a new team, but an existing team might have had many, many changes. They might have been people moving in and out. I'm talking about the porous nature of teams now. People move in and out of team systems. They might have changed over time. But what hasn't been revisited is, how do the team members learn to deal with each other? How do we create the space so that they start to understand what it is to be part of that group or unit or system? And so that's where, as a leader, you're being much more directive to create that context. So I think it has resonance not just with a brand new team, but with existing teams that have gone on for some time. The storming bit, again, is the bit, in forming a team, it's that bit where it's really stressful, lots of negotiation, lots of tensions. It's the sort of the turbulent bit where people are starting to work out how they're going to be together. Again, I think I just want to draw that out because I think it's seen in a sequence, but actually I think sometimes when we're reflecting on what is happening with our teams, we might have to revisit that stage and say, actually, we might have an established team, but change has happened. And if I reflect on it, we need to think about how the team work together. So we need to be doing that storming stage. And again, that's where your leadership is thinking from a much more directive but facilitative. You're bringing those two things together. So you're creating a space for some of those individuals to really have some strong negotiation about how will we be together, but it needs direction. It needs that leadership to direct and facilitate it. I won't touch on norming and performing because I think they're really, they're talking about team having an identity and feeling connected. You might well be in that system. Roles are known, they're understood, they're accepted, and so that's the normal identity of the team. Again, if we use this as a reflection and a reflective tool, is that the case? Do we think that the team have a strong identity? Do they feel connected? How do we know? What's your litmus test to know whether actually everybody feels part of the team and this is now our team behaviour? This is what we do. So I suppose I'm inviting you to think that actually those concepts can be useful as a reflective framework. So you can start to think, oh, when I'm thinking about my team, where do I think they are? Performing, obviously, is the final stage, which is really about optimal performance. It's been achieved, and essentially it's argued in that model that you only really get there if you've been through the other three. But I suppose I'm inviting you to think, how does this framework allow me to reflect on where I think my teams are at? I'm going to share another thing with you, which is really thinking about if you are in that storming stage, and so there may be multiple problems, there may be things going on in terms of tensions, in terms of conflict, and so this is quite a useful way of thinking about how team problems can really be resolved. And so this approach talks about sort of 4 stages, which is really about exploration. What is the problem? What's understood to be the problem? This is a really important stage because actually it goes back to the sort of meaning making. And how is the problem understood by everybody? You may be a leader looking in and seeing problematic behaviour. You may see tensions between people, but those two individuals may have a very different perspective. So it's about really clarifying and creating conversations that allow for a clarification and an exploration of the problem. It's not easy. But the idea is the opportunity to really think about having a shared view of the problem. And that is the reason it's important, because then without doing that, it's really difficult to get a team to think about, or team members to think about, what might be the solutions. There has to be a sense of what the problem is. Sometimes in your leadership, you might be having to articulate what the problem is and really then do some exploration as to how people understand that, and then really take people on a journey to start to think much more solution orientated. When you're doing this and you generate some ideas about solutions, one of the things is making sure that you're not find the problem. And this is not just a team level, but it could be about individuals, that actually the solution that's been identified is just a reframing of things that are being done already. So the creativity part of thinking about this is the ideation, which is the bit where you generate different alternatives to a problem. The selection one is really being critical, really critiquing those solutions to make sure that what's been generated in the ideation is these could be options for change, these could be solutions, and not a reframe of the existing problem. And so the selection bit is really being challenging and exploratory, and really looking at, well, if this happened, how would it impact on someone else? Who would notice? What would be the reaction of other people? So certainly with the team, you might be thinking about, well, if, with each of the solutions, what would be the reaction of people? With an individual, it might be exploring about what would be different? How would the response be to the problem? So it really forces you to think, actually, let's be careful, which is a tendency of all of us to do, to maybe redress a problem and offer a solution that's actually more of the same thing. And that goes back to sort of the challenge of change, really. And so that's when the implementation comes in. And the sense with this approach is that actually implementation, if you do the first is carefully, then implementation of solution is problematic. And so that invites you to think, actually, going back to the connection with the storming, I suppose, and forming, that it's that bit at the very beginning in both of these models where there's time and space and capacity and energy given to really driving home the opportunity to be able to unpack what is actually going on. And that isn't always easy and it's not always smooth, but I suppose it's thinking about, if you invest in that stage of really understanding the issue, understanding the dynamics at work, understanding the interface, what is creating or sustaining or maintaining the problem, taking time, that means that actually identifying a solution becomes interestingly creative, possibly, if we are challenged about it. But then it means that we can implement something that's really different and a different approach. One of the things to bear in mind, that when you do that and when you really push against trying not to reinvent the same wheel, that in itself may have teething problems. And so it's been able to sit with a bit of tentativeness as to, is this going to work? Let's just see. Let's give it a go. But you've had the thinking and the shared creativity to say, let's just try this solution. And it's something that can be done with an individual or with a team. But I think it's important to think about that these may be steps that you do take people with you. So how you use yourself goes back to that whole thing about communication. So I think the last element I suppose I want to really think with you about is, in a way, bringing together some of the things we've thought about, that when we think about the team dynamics, what might be happening with the team, what might be the forces at play, how do you sit within it? It's really interesting to think about context. So that systems theory element, if we're trying to understand the behaviour of others and the behaviour of ourselves in relation to others, context is fundamental. And I suppose going back to what I said in the beginning, that it may well be that we have to take a little bit of a step back to understand an individual's context, to do some self-reflection on our own context, what's happening for us, but also thinking about the team sitting within a wider organisational context. How is that impacting on what you see in front of you? What might be the drivers that might be sitting within the wider organisational system that might be showing itself in the behaviours and the actions and the attitudes and the interactions that you're trying to keep a hold of in your team? So context, lifting things to context, become quite important. Maybe drilling more into, thinking about even more systemically, invites us to think about multiple perspectives. So always thinking that actually our view of the world and the lens in which we're looking at our team and understanding our team is just our view of the world. And sometimes, in order for us to really make sense of the behaviours and what's going on and our own behaviour, we need to recognise that around any issue, whether it's a challenging issue around conflict or we're talking about change that needs to happen, there will be multiple perspectives. And we have to think about how we are able to understand those perspectives and share those so that we can start to make positive steps forward. And the final one to think about, I think, is around positioning. This is quite key. It's about thinking about our own place. Where are we located in relation to the issue? How are we positioning ourselves? But how do others position us as managers and leaders? Similarly, when we think about individuals within a team, where are they being positioned and by whom? Maybe we are locating them in a particular narrative or story, or we have a sense of them that may be part of our own ideas. It may be part of a team idea that's formed, but also when we think about problems in a team, we need to think about how you are located or how team members are located, because sometimes being able to tackle and change things relies on people to recognise they have a sense of agency, or they may be looking to you to solve it as the manager and leader, but not recognise that they have some stake and capacity to bring about change themselves. So really, I think when we think about teams in a systemic and systems way, it allows us to think about ourselves and what might be happening for the team across multiple levels, thinking about some of the dominant stories and narratives, thinking about what does change mean, why is change happening, why does it need to happen, what are the drivers, and how's that impacting on this team system. Therefore, how may they understand that, and what are the conversations that need to happen so that change can be managed and understood. So I think it's definitely one of the things that we need to consider when we're thinking about team dynamics is how we are really starting to have those conversations about difference. How do we understand the challenge of being able to really harness who we have within our teams, really harness our own capacity, our skills, our knowledge, our way of being, to be able to really work with these groups of individuals who've come together to be part of the team. So I know I've gone through quite a lot of things in quite a light detail, but I'm just interested in whether there are any questions that people might have. And I've just having a quick look at some of the comments. So Pauline, you've asked about how you might approach setting out your vision for the team or asking for their input. I mean, one of the things that's really quite nice is being able to create, particularly if it's never been done before, they've never really been invited to ask their opinion. One of the things that's quite good to do is to really set out with them. So maybe it could be, I don't know, a short away day or a team meeting that's extended, or some session that's dedicated to being able to think about change in your vision. But certainly one of the things that you might want to think about is setting out your narrative as a manager and leader. Who are you? What are you about? What's your vision for the future? So in a sense, you're kind of establishing your personal narrative. So they start to think about you in the role of team manager, I suppose. It's starting to give them a sense of who you are, what your motivations are. I think firstly, if they get a sense of who you are and you're able to talk to that and speak to your public narrative and give them a sense of your drivers, even in terms of your motivation, so they start to see the personalized you. It starts that connection. It starts to engage them with who you are as a person. They may have all sorts of ideas about who you are. They might have myths and stories, but they may also be not aware or sure of who you are. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing is to acknowledge the change that they may not have had a choice over. Sometimes people feel that if it's acknowledged, it might not be what they like. It may be what it is. So you're not really kind of opening up this space to just say, let's stay with the negativity of what you feel. It's about, I recognise and I know this is a change you weren't expecting or not planned for. So I'm going to stand with you on that, and I recognise that. But we need to think about how do we move forward from here? What would it look like? What kind of team? I'd really like to get your contribution into how we think about this new team system. What's our vision? What can we be doing? What's our goal for the future? So I think there's something about how you create that dedicated space that gives you the chance to give them a sense of who you are. You start to set out your narrative because your team system's changing, and also acknowledging that how changes happen may not be in the way that they've planned for or thought about, but actually change can be a good thing. And it's an opportunity. At this point, you really want to get them involved in thinking about what does this new team look like now and what can it be achieving for the future. So you really start to bring in their voices quite early on, but it's really future orientated. So certainly if you're moving from one particular type of role to a new one after a huge given amount of time, one of the things that I think might be helpful for you to take away and reflect on is what's your vision for that? What kind of ideas do you hold about leading a new team? What's your sense of what you'd like to be doing, being perceived as, and being recognized to be as a leader of the new team? So there's something about how you do a little bit of reflection for yourself to work out your ideas and your vision for the new team. And as I said, if it's a change of role, there'll be learning and there'll be opportunities for you to think differently. But there's something that's quite powerful about being transparent about that. So sometimes when we move from one team to another, and I've certainly done the same, where there's something about our transparency that even in a management leadership role, we're open to learning, that we don't have all the answers, but we really are interested in working with the new team and working with the new service to build an amazing team. And so the reality is that it's not taken away from you in a leadership role, but what it's doing is setting the store for what type of leader and manager you want, what kind of team you want to create. And I think the key from the very early days will be thinking about how do you from the off create the spaces and create ways in which you get to know and learn about your new team. Who are the personalities? How might you get to know them? What are the dynamics? So how can you build in observations so that your observations become not just part of frontline work, but you're observing from a managerial point of view, and you're really using that intelligence to be able to understand and know people in your team. Look at what dynamics, what are the patterns, as I mentioned before, what are the implicit and explicit ways that the team have worked in, and how might you want to then think about change if change needs to happen. So hopefully that's something you can think about as you move across, Shireen. Okay. I think we're fast coming to the end of the time. I'm hoping that was useful. I'm thinking that actually it was, it's always a very broad topic, and I think I recognise that this is just a kind of more of an overview really, and it might be interesting for people to experience much more personalised ways of thinking about team dynamics. And so I think it's always useful to think about how might you have maybe more focused personal reflection space to think about the dynamics you're dealing with an individual. But I'm hoping that this was a general overview that gave you something that you can take away for today. So great to meet you, and I'll say goodbye.